Hi, welcome to my channel. Today I'm working with a text by Bunn called How to Read Like a Writer. If you don't know how to start in on a piece and pay attention to the parts that matter, I'm hoping that this will help you. So the first thing that I do when I am starting in on a text that I need to read in order to be able to have a conversation is I go to another document and I write in a outline of what I see in the text. So over here you can see what does it mean to read like a writer, and you can see I've written that there. And I've done that for the entire article so I know where the main headers are. So for right now, I'm just going to read the first section and then stop, talk about it, and then move to the second section. In 1997, I was a recent college graduate living in London for 6 months and working at the Palace Theatre owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber. The Palace was a beautiful red brick 4-story theatre in the heart of London's famous West End, and 8 times a week it housed a 3-hour performance of the musical Les Miserables. Because of the antiquated fire safety laws, every theatre in the city was required to have a certain number of staff members inside, watching the performance in case of an emergency. My job, in addition to wearing a red tuxedo jacket, was to sit inside the dark theatre with the patrons and make sure nothing went wrong. It didn't seem to matter to my supervisor that I had no training in security and no idea where we kept the fire extinguishers. I was pretty sure that if there was any trouble, I'd be running down the back stairs, leaving the patrons to fend for themselves. I had no intention of dying in a bright red tuxedo. There was a red coat stationed on each of the theater's 4 floors, and we all passed the time by sitting quietly in the back, reading books with tiny flashlights. It's not easy trying to read in the dim light of a theater, flashlight or no flashlight, and it's even tougher with shrieks and shouts and gunshots coming from the stage. I had to focus intently on each and every word, often rereading a single sentence several times. Sometimes I got distracted and had to reread entire paragraphs. As I struggled to read in this environment, I began to realize that the way I was reading, one word at a time, was exactly the same way that the author had written the text. I realized writing is a word-by-word, sentence-by-sentence process. The intense concentration required to read in the theater helped me recognize some of the interesting ways that authors string words into phrases, into paragraphs, into entire books. I came to realize that all writing consists of a series of choices. I was an English major in college, but I don't think I ever thought about reading. I read all the time. I read for my classes and on the computer and sometimes for fun, but I never really thought about the important connections between reading and writing, and how reading in a particular way could also make me a better writer. All right, so that's the introduction. If I jump up and read like a writer, the first thing I notice is that he's telling a story. And so the first 3 paragraphs, I was in this college space, I was doing this job, my job was to do these things, I read, and when I read, I discovered something. So the really important part of this happens right here. When I write up my summary, that's what's going to go over here. All right, so if I'm reading this text and I want to do an outline, I'm going to take the first 3 paragraphs and scantily describe what goes on there, because they're really just setting a story up. And then he's moving to his point, which is that writing is a series of choices, and if you notice those choices when you're reading, it can help you make similar sorts of choices when you're the writer. So if you can see the connection between reading and writing, it can help you become a better writer. That's the goal of this text, to show you how that works. So if I'm doing an outline, my outline doesn't have to be very long. I'm really just looking at 4 sentences, but I'm catching the main point. That's the really big important part of this. So when you're reading, you really have to think, what's the main important point here? All right, so if I go back to the text, I want to just preview what's coming next. So I've got, what does it mean to read like a writer? And I've got just about 5 paragraphs. So I want to pay attention to what he's doing as he's doing it, and then I want to come back in and fill in that section. When you read like a writer, or RLW, so we'll remember that from now on, you work to identify some of the choices the author made so that you can better understand how some such choices might arise in your own writing. The idea is to carefully examine the things you read, looking at the writerly techniques in the text in order to decide if you might want to adopt similar or the same techniques in your writing. So I'm going to pause for a second here and go back up to that intro. He starts with a story in order to get at a point that he's then going to elaborate for the rest of his essay. So if you wanted to write a story about your experiences and then get to a point about them that you then elaborate in the rest of the essay, you might look at how he told that story and think about creating something similar yourself. That's reading like a writer, right? So when you read like a writer, you're looking for the choices that the person made and then deciding whether or not you like them yourself. So I'm back to the second little string that's called the paragraph maybe. You're reading to learn about writing. Instead of reading for content or to better understand the ideas in the writing, which you will automatically do to some degree anyway, you are trying to understand how the piece of writing was put together by the author and what you can learn about writing by reading a particular text. As you read in this way, you think about how the choices the author made and the techniques that he or she used are influencing your own responses as a reader. What is it about the way this text is written that makes you feel and respond the way you do? Again, let me pause for a second and go back up to that intro. I can see him in that red coat. I can see him deciding that if he were actually to encounter a fire, he would run. And I can think about why he told that story and said that confession, because maybe that works for the audience, and maybe it makes the audience think, well, why wouldn't you just figure out what you were supposed to do when you were having a fire in front of you? And so it's this idea of thinking about the choice in what he chose to say about that story that's also interesting in this moment. So what is it about the way this text is written that makes you feel and respond the way you do? The goal as you read like a writer is to locate what you believe are the most important writerly choices represented in the text. Choices as large as the overall structure or as small as a single word used only once, to consider the effect of these choices on potential readers, including yourself. Then you can go one step further and imagine what different choices the author might have made instead, and what effect these different choices would have on readers. Say you're reading an essay in class that begins with a short quote from President Barack Obama about the war in Iraq. As a writer, what do you think of this technique? Do you think it's effective to begin the essay with a quote? What if the essay began with a quote from someone else? What if it was a much longer quote from President Obama, or a quote from the president about something other than the war? And here is where we get to the most important part. Would you want to try this technique in your own writing? Would you want to start your essay with a quote? Do you think it would be effective to begin your essay with a quote from President Obama? What about a quote from somebody else? You could make yourself a list. What are the advantages and disadvantages of starting with a quote? What about the advantages and disadvantages of starting with a quote from the president? How would other readers respond to this technique? Would certain readers, say Democrats or liberals, appreciate an essay that started with a quote from President Obama better than other readers, say Republicans or conservatives? What would be the advantages and disadvantages of starting with a quote from a less divisive person? What about starting with a quote from someone more divisive? The goal is to carefully consider the choices the author made and the techniques that he or she used, and then decide whether you want to make the same choices or use those same techniques in your own writing. Author and professor Wendy Bishop explains how her reading process changed when she began to read like a writer. It wasn't until I claimed the sentence as my area of desire, interest, and expertise, until I wanted to be a writer writing better, that I had to look underneath my initial readings. I started asking how. How did the writer get me to feel? How did the writer say something so that it remains in my memory, when many other things too easily fall out? How did the writer communicate his or her intentions about genre, about irony? Bishop moved from simply reporting her personal reactions to the things she read to attempting to uncover how the author led her and other readers to have those reactions. This effort to uncover how authors build texts is what makes reading like a writer so useful for student writers. Okay, so we've basically got a small essay here, and the essay is, let me define what it is to read like a writer, and then let me give you an example, and then let me give you another person saying the same thing I just said, and then I think maybe I can say this might be useful for you as a student writer. So I'm going to pause here and do an outline from my text for you. All right, so when I read through this, I decided to put paragraphs and numbers down, and that kind of worked for me for a little bit. But you can see, look at the writer techniques and decide how you could adopt them, understand how the author put these ideas together, what are the choices, what are the effects on the readers. the example of Obama, do you start with a quotation? What do you list as the advantages and disadvantages? And then a Wendy Bishop part. So I'm really doing a terse outline of it, and I'm hoping that if I come back to this in 4 months, that example of Obama will still be in my head. I think it will, and so that's my risk I'm taking. So we go back to this process and go some more. So how is RLW different from normal reading? And so we can anticipate that in this small section, there will be a small essay here that explains to us the difference. So here we go. Most of the time we read for information. We read a recipe to learn how to bake lasagna. We read the sports page to see if our school won the game, Facebook to see who has commented on our status update, a history book to learn about the Vietnam War, and the syllabus to see when the next writing assignment is due. Reading like a writer asks for something very different. In 1940, a famous poet and critic named Alan Tate discussed 2 different ways of reading. There are many ways to read, but generally speaking, there are 2 ways. They correspond to the 2 ways in which we may be interested in a piece of architecture. If the building has Corinthian columns, we can trace the origin and development of Corinthian columns. We are interested as historians. But if we are interested as architects, we may or may not know about the history of the Corinthian style. We must, however, know all about the construction of the building, down to the last nail or peg in the beams. We've got to know this if we are going to put up the building ourselves. Well, I don't know anything about Corinthian columns and doubt that I will ever want to know anything about Corinthian columns. Alan Tate's metaphor of reading as if you were an architect is a great way to think about RLW. When you read like a writer, you are trying to figure out how the text you are reading was constructed so that you learn how to build one for yourself. Author David Jouse makes a similar comparison when he writes that reading won't help you much unless you learn to read like a writer. You must look at a book the way a carpenter looks at a house someone else built, examining the details in order to see how it was made. Perhaps I should change the name and call this Reading Like an Architect or Reading Like a Carpenter. In a way, those names make perfect sense. You are reading to see how something was constructed so that you can construct something similar yourself. Okay, so we'll take a break, and what you want to do is put in your summaries for each of these paragraphs. Okay, I've come in and looked at how is RLW different from normal reading. We read for information. There are 2 ways to read, one to learn and how to build is the second, 2 comparisons, one to Corinthian columns and one to houses. You're reading to learn how something was constructed. It's not a very long passage, and my reflection on it should remind me of it later, and it'll help me to remember what this was about. So now I'm going to come in and read the next section, which is Why Learn to Read Like a Writer. Again, I'm going to preview it. Again, it's just a short essay. It has 3 paragraphs in it, and they're pretty much doing the same sort of thing as the last 2 parts. So, and you can notice this because you can see that he brings in a quote at each of these spaces in a way that helps you to see the point from someone else's perspective. And if you were thinking about how to bring in sources in your text, this might be one way. So, for most college students, RLW is a new way to read, and it can be difficult to learn at first. Making things even more difficult is that your college writing instructors may expect you to read this way for class, but never actually teach you how to do it. He or she may not even tell you that you're supposed to read this way. This is because most writing instructors are so focused on teaching writing that they forget to show students how they want them to read. That's what this essay is for. In addition to the fact that your college writing instructor may expect you to read like a writer, this kind of reading is also one of the very best ways to learn how to write well. Reading like a writer can help you understand how the process of writing is a series of making choices, and in doing so, can help you recognize important decisions you might face and techniques you might want to use when working on your own writing. Reading this way becomes an opportunity to think and learn about writing. Charles Moran, a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts, urges us to read like writers because when we read like writers, we understand and participate in the writing. We see the choices the writer has made, and we see how the writer has coped with the consequences of those choices. We see what the writer is doing because we read as writers. We see because we have written ourselves and know the territory, know the feel of it, know some of the moves ourselves. You are already an author, and that means you have a built-in advantage when reading like a writer. All of your previous writing experiences, inside the classroom and out, contribute to your success with RLW. Because you have written things yourself, just as Moran suggests, you are better able to see the choices that the author is making in the text that you read. This in turn helps you to think about whether you want to make some of those same choices in your own writing and what the consequences might be for your readers if you do. All right, here's the thing. I've got 3 paragraphs basically, and I'm just going to summarize them over under the header, Why Learn to Read Like a Writer. So I'm going to go do that and talk to you in a second. What are some questions to ask before you start reading? As I sat down to work on this essay, I contacted a few of my former students to ask what advice they would give to college students regarding how to read effectively in the writing classroom, and also to get their thoughts on RLW. Throughout the rest of the essay, I'd like to share some of their insights and suggestions. After all, who is better qualified to help you learn what you need to know about reading in college writing classes than students who recently took those courses themselves? One of the things that several students mentioned to do first before you even start reading is to consider the context surrounding both the assignment and the text you're reading. As one former student, Allison, states, "The reading I did in college asked me to go above and beyond, not only in breadth of subject matter, but in depth, with regards to informed analysis and background information on context." Allison was asked to think about some of the factors that went into the creation of the text, as well as some of the factors influencing her own experience of reading. Taken together, these constitute the context of reading. Another former student, Jamie, suggests that students learn about the historical context of the writings they will read for class. Writing professor Richard Straub puts it this way: you're not going to just read a text, you're going to read a text within a certain context, a set of circumstances. It's one kind of writing or another, designed for one audience and purpose or another. Among the contextual factors you'll want to consider before you even start reading are, do you know the author's purpose for this piece of writing? Do you know the intended audiences? Do you know who the intended audience is for this piece of writing? So I think we know that from the title of it and from what we've read so far, but that's a really key thing to think about, and it's usually something you can predict from the title. It may be that you need to start reading before you can answer these first 2 questions, but it's worth trying to answer them before you start. For example, if you know at the outset that the author is trying to reach a very specific group of readers, then his or her writerly techniques may seem more or less effective than if she or he was trying to reach a more general audience. Similarly, returning to our earlier example of beginning an essay with a quote from President Obama about the war in Iraq, if you know that the author's purpose is to address some of the dangers and drawbacks of warfare, this may be a very effective opening. If the purpose is to encourage Americans to wear sunscreen while at the beach, this opening makes no sense at all. One former student, Lola, explained that most of her reading assignments in college classes were designed to provoke analysis and criticisms into the structure, style, and purpose of the writing itself. Another important thing to consider before reading is the genre of the text. Genre means a few different things in college English classes, but it's most often used to indicate the type of writing: a poem, a newspaper article, an essay, a short story, a novel, a legal brief, an instruction manual, etc. Because the conventions for each genre can be very different. Who ever heard of a 900-page newspaper article? Techniques that are effective for one genre may not work well in another. Many readers expect poems and pop songs to rhyme, for example, but might react negatively to a legal brief or instruction manual that did so. Another former student, Mike, comments on how important the genre of the text can be for reading. I think a lot of the way I read, of course, depends on the type of text I'm reading. If I'm reading philosophy, I always look for signaling words: however, therefore, furthermore, despite, indicating the direction of the argument. When I read fiction or creative nonfiction, I look for how the author inserts dialogue or character sketches within narration or environmental observation. After reading To the Lighthouse last semester, I have noticed how much more attentive I've become to the types of narration: omniscient, impersonal, psychological, realistic, etc., and how these different approaches are utilized to achieve an author's overall effect. Although Mike specifically mentions what he looked for while reading a published novel, one of the great things about RLW is that it can be used equally well with either published or student-produced writing. So we're still in this section. It's a big section. We've gotten what are some of the questions to ask. We've gotten what is a genre. Is this piece is this a published or a student-produced piece of writing is next. As you read both kinds of text, you can locate the choices the author made and imagine the different decisions that he or she might have made. While it might seem a little weird at first to imagine how published texts could be written differently, after all, they were good enough to be published. Remember that all writing can be improved. Scholar Nancy Walker believes that it's important for students to read published works like RLW because the work ceases to be a mere artifact, a stone tablet, and becomes instead a living utterance with immediacy and texture. It could have been better or worse than it is had the author made different choices. As Walker suggests, it's worth thinking about how the published text would be different, maybe even better, if the author had made different choices in the writing, because you may be faced with similar choices in your own work. So, is this the kind of writing you will be assigned to write yourself? Knowing ahead of time what kinds of writing assignments you will be asked to complete can really help you to read like a writer. It's probably impossible, and definitely too time-consuming, to identify all the choices the author made and all techniques an author used, so it's important to prioritize while reading. Knowing what you'll be writing yourself can help you prioritize. It may be the case that your instructor has assigned the text you're reading to serve as a model for the kind of writing you'll be doing later. Jesse, a former student, writes, "In college writing classes, we knew we were reading for a purpose, to influence or inspire our work. The reading that I have done in college writing courses has always been really specific to a certain type of writing, and it allows me to focus and experiment on that specific style in depth and without distraction." If the text you're reading is a model of a particular style of writing, for example, highly emotional or humorous, RLW is particularly helpful because you can look at a piece you're reading and think about whether you want to adopt a similar style in your own writing. You might realize that the author is trying to arouse sympathy in readers and examine what techniques he or she uses to do this. Then you can decide whether those techniques might work well in your own writing. You might notice that the author keeps including jokes or funny stories and think about whether you want to include them in your writing. What would the impact be to your potential readers? So this was a big section. It's almost 3 pages, I think. So it's going to take a bit of time to go through and outline it, but try to do that and keep the headers in as you do that. If you're looking at the article's organization, both of these sections are much longer. So this is where he's getting at the heart of what he wants to argue. So what are the questions to ask as you're reading? It is helpful to continue to ask yourself questions as you read like a writer. As you're first learning to read in this new way, you may want to have a set of questions written or typed out in front of you that you can refer to while reading. Eventually, after plenty of practice, you will start to ask certain questions, and locate certain things in the text almost automatically. Remember, for most students, this is a new way of reading, and you'll have to train yourself to do it well. Also keep in mind that you're reading to understand how the text was written, how the house was built, more than you're trying to determine the meaning of the things you read or assess whether the texts are good or bad. So a lot of times when I assign something like this, a reader will say, "I didn't like this idea." And the issue for this type of reading is not to think about whether or not you like the idea or not. It's to look at how the author put it together. That's sort of a fundamental underlying approach to something we call a rhetorical analysis. Yeah, we can agree and disagree with the actual article, but can you see how the author staged the argument? That's what we're looking at. So first, return just 2 of the same questions I suggested that you consider before. What's the author's purpose for this piece of writing, and who is the intended audience? Think about these 2 questions again as you read. It may be that you couldn't really answer them before, or that your ideas will change while reading. Knowing why the piece was written and who it's for can help explain why the author might have made certain choices or used particular techniques in the writing. And you can assess those choices and techniques based in part on how effective they are in fulfilling the purpose and or reaching the intended audience. Beyond these initial 2 questions, there is an almost endless list of questions you might ask regarding writing choices and techniques. Here are some of the questions that one former student, Claire, asks herself. When reading, I tend to be asking myself a million questions. If I were writing this, where would I go with the story? If the author goes in a different directions, as they so often do, from what I'm thinking, I will ask myself, why did they do this? What are they telling me? Claire tries to figure out why the author might have made a move in the writing that she hadn't anticipated, but even more importantly, she asks herself what she would do if she were the author. Reading the text becomes an opportunity for Claire to think about her own role as an author. Here are some additional examples of the kinds of questions you might ask yourself. How effective is the language the author uses? Is it too formal, too informal, perfectly appropriate? Depending on the subject matter and the intended audience, it may make sense to be more or less formal in terms of language. As you begin reading, you can ask yourself whether the word choice and tone and language of the writing seem appropriate. What kinds of evidence does the author use to support his or her claims? Does he or she use statistics, quote from famous people, personal anecdotes, or personal stories? Does he or she cite books or articles? So one of the things you can think right now is, who has he used as his sources? He's used writing instructors that he has that are in print, and he's used his former students as experts. That's a really specific decision because he's writing to students talking about how to learn to read, and those voices really give his argument support. So how appropriate or effective is this evidence? Would a different type of evidence or some combination of evidence be more effective? To some extent, the kinds of questions you ask should be determined by the genre of writing you're reading. For example, it's probably worth examining the evidence that the author uses to support his or her claims if you're reading an opinion column, but less important if you're reading a short story. An opinion column is often intended to convince readers of something, so the kinds of evidence used are often very important. A short story may be intended to convince readers of something sometimes, but probably not in the same way. A short story rarely includes claims or evidence in the way we usually think about them. Are there places in the writing you find confusing? What about the writing in those places makes it unclear or confusing? It's pretty normal to get confused in places while reading, especially while reading for class, so it can be helpful to look closely at the writing and try and get a sense of what exactly tripped you up. This way you can learn to avoid those same problems in your own writing. How does the author move from one idea to another in the writing? Are the transitions between the ideas effective? How else might she have transitioned between ideas instead? Notice that in these questions, I am encouraging you to question whether aspects of the writing are appropriate and effective, in addition to deciding whether you liked or disliked them. You want to imagine how other readers might respond to the writing and the techniques you've identified. Deciding whether you liked or disliked something is only about you. Considering whether the technique is appropriate or effective lets you contemplate what the author might have been trying to do and to decide whether a majority of readers might find the move successful. This is important because it's the same thing you should be thinking about while you're writing. How will readers respond to this technique I'm using, to this sentence, to this word? As you read, ask yourself what the author is doing at each step of the way, and then consider whether the same choice of technique might work in your own writing. Okay, what I've done is come in and just give myself a set of questions and respond to this. When I clean this up to hand it in, I will put headers in this. I will put ways to connect it to parts of the actual text. So I might put page numbers on this. I'll have a way for it to be easy for the person who's reading it to see that I've got a sense of the organization. So right now, what are the questions to ask while reading? I would come up here and change this to a title, not the title, heavens, to maybe a bigger font. So I'll go through and format this later, but for right now, I'm just putting stuff down on the page. So what should you be writing as you're reading? The most common suggestion made by former students, mentioned by every single one of them, was to mark up the text, make comments in the margins, and write yourself notes and summaries both during and after reading. Often the notes students took while reading became ideas or material for the students to use in their own papers. It's important to read with a pen or highlighter in your hand so that you can mark right on the text all those spots where you identify an interesting choice the author has made or a writerly technique you might want to use. One thing I like to do is to highlight and underline the passage in the text itself, and then try to answer the following 3 questions on my notepad. What is the technique the author is using here? Is this technique effective? What would be the advantages and disadvantages if I tried the same technique in my own writing? By utilizing the same process of highlighting and note-taking, you'll end up with a useful list of specific techniques to have at your disposal when it comes to begin your own writing. So it's a short little space, but we're going to take the time to just write it down on our notes. So I've just done a really quick note-taking on that. It's not a lot because it's not a big amount, so my summary of it is as short as it needs to be. This next section is going to take a while, so here we go. What does RLW look like in action? Let's go back to the opening paragraph of this essay and spend some time reading like writers as a way to get more comfortable with the process. In 1997, I was a recent college graduate, living in London for 6 months and working at the Palace Theatre owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber. The Palace was a beautiful red brick 4-story theatre in the heart of London's famous West End, and 8 times a week it housed a 3-hour performance of the musical Les Miserables. Because of the antiquated fire safety laws, every theatre in the city was required to have a certain number of staff members inside watching the performance in case of an emergency. Let's begin with those questions I encouraged you to try to answer before you start reading. I realize we're cheating a little bit in this case since you've already read most of this essay, but this is just practice. When doing this in your own, you should attempt to answer these questions before reading and then return to them as you read to further develop your answers. Do you know the author's purpose for this piece of writing? I hope the purpose is clear by now. If it isn't, I'm doing a pretty lousy job of explaining how and why you might read like a writer. Do you know who the intended audience is? Again, I hope that you know this one by now. What about the genre? Is this an essay, an article? What would you call it? You know that it's published and not student writing. How does this influence your expectations for what you'll read? Are you going to be asked to write something like this yourself? Probably not in your writing class, but you can still use RLW to learn about writerly techniques that you might want to use in whatever you end up writing. Now, ask yourself questions as you read. I'm not going to read that again. It's the first paragraph. Since this paragraph is the very first one, it makes sense to think about how it introduces readers to the essay. What techniques does the author use to begin the text? This is a personal story about his time working in London. What else do you notice as you read over this passage? Is the passage vague or specific about where he worked? You know that the author worked in a famous part of London in a beautiful theatre owned by a well-known composer. Are those details important? How different would this opening be instead if I had written, in 1997, I was living in London and working at a theatre that showed Les Miserables. This is certainly shorter, and some of you may prefer this version. It's quick, to the point. But what, if anything, is lost by eliminating so much of the detail? I chose to include each of the details that the revised sentence omits, so it's worth considering why. Why did I mention where the theatre was located? Why did I explain that I was living in London right after finishing college? Does it matter that it was after college? What effect might I have hoped the inclusion of these details would have on readers? Is this reference to college an attempt to connect with my audience of college students? Am I trying to establish my credibility as an author by announcing that I went to college? Why might I want the readers to know that this was a theater owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber? Do you think I am just trying to mention a famous name that readers will recognize? Will Andrew Lloyd Webber figure prominently in the rest of the essay? These are all reasonable questions to ask. They are not necessarily the right questions to ask, but there are no right questions. They certainly aren't the only questions you could ask either. The goal is to train yourself to formulate questions as you read based on whatever you notice in the text. Your own reactions to what you're reading will help determine the kinds of questions to ask. Now, take a broader perspective. I begin this essay, an essay about reading, by talking about my job in a theater in London. Why? Doesn't this seem like an odd way to begin an essay about reading? If you read on a little further, feel free to scan back up at the top of this essay, you learn in the third full paragraph that the connection is between working in the theater and reading like a writer. But why include this information at all? What does this story add to the essay? Is it worth the space it takes up? Think about the effect presenting this personal information might have on readers. Does it make it feel like a real person, some ordinary guy is talking to you? Does it draw you into the essay and make you want to keep reading? What about the language I use? Is it formal or more informal? This is a time when you can really narrow your focus and look at particular words. Because of antiquated fire safety laws, every theater in the city was required to have a certain number of staff members inside watching the performance in case of an emergency. What is the effect of using the word antiquated to describe fire safety laws? It certainly projects a negative impression. If the laws were described as antiquated, it means I view them as old-fashioned, as obsolete. This is a fairly uncommon word, so it stands out, drawing attention to my choice to use it. The word also sounds quite formal. Am I formal in the rest of the sentence? I use the word performance when I just as easily could have written show. For that matter, I could have written old instead of antiquated. You can proceed like this throughout the sentence, thinking about alternative choices I could have made and what the effect would be. Instead of staff members, I could have written employees or just workers. Notice the difference if the sentence had been written. Because of old fire safety laws, every theater in the city was required to have a certain number of workers inside watching the show in case of emergency. Which version is more likely to appeal to readers? You can try to answer this question by thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of using formal language. When would you want to use formal language in your writing, and when would it make more sense to be more conversational? As you can see from discussing just this one paragraph, you could ask questions about the text forever. Luckily, you don't have to. As you continue reading like a writer, you'll learn to notice techniques that seem new and pay less attention to the ones you've thought about before. The more you practice, the quicker the process becomes until you're reading like a writer almost automatically. I want to end this essay by sharing one more set of comments by my former student Lola, this time about what it means to read like a writer. Reading as a writer would compel me to question what might have brought the author to make these decisions and then decide what worked and what didn't. What could have made that chapter better or easier to understand? How can I make sure I include some of the good attributes of this writing style into my own? How can I take aspects that I feel the writer failed at and make sure not to make the same mistakes in my writing? Questioning why the author made certain decisions, considering what techniques could have made the text better, deciding how to include the best attributes of what you're reading in your own writing, this is what reading like a writer is all about. Are you ready to start reading? You don't have to answer the discussion questions. You can see the works cited to see how a works cited works in the document. But mainly what you've got to do now is just go back through and say, how do I talk about how long it took for him to get through what it means to read like a writer? Right, so that's the last section. So I hope this helps a bit to have someone read something aloud to you, and that's why I did it. I hope to see you soon. Ciao.